You know him as an accomplished actor who's won praise and awards in such movies as The Color Purple, Beloved, and the Lethal Weapon films. But that's only part of the story. He's also a fearless supporter of human rights, literacy, and the struggle to abolish the death penalty. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. On this episode of Interviews, our conversation with actor and UN Goodwill Ambassador, Danny Glover. Does there come a point in your career where you're free to do what you want to do?
Not really. I mean, I don't think you can choose not to work or work. That becomes the choice that you make, not that you have an opportunity to do what you want to do. And the question is always, with all of us, no matter where we are, in our careers. So the question is, what do we want to do? I've done films in my career where I've made choices, and certainly they were monetarily important, and they had a major impact on my resource base. But I've done other films too that I received no money on, and that they were films that I thought were important to do. Certainly, when I think about how I want to lend my name to the work that I do now, of course, at this stage, I say, how can I use my leverage to do the kind of films that I want to do? Mm-hmm. Where can I find other sources and other support for the kind of films that I want to do? Sometimes you get so caught up in the career that you forget about those things, or you put those things aside. But you're never in a situation where, and people often ask me that question, have you reached a point in your career where you can choose this or choose that? A career has many ebbs and flows to it, and certainly you do big films and you do small films. And I want to make sure that the films that I do, for the most part, are films that are important to me because they have another kind of life to them. Yeah. They have another kind of, they express something else that I want to say about my relationship to the world. Not all films that I've done in the past, or perhaps have the opportunity to do in the future, will do that. But for the most part, that's what my thoughts are.
Do you still find it being an obstacle that you're an African-American actor, or is it at a point now that you can be received as simply an actor?
Well, I think the difficulty in expressing this in terms of whether I'm an African-American actor or it's too small. It's a very small question for me. The question is what stories I'm going to tell, what experience that I'm going to enlighten or upheld, what values I want in those. That becomes more. I mean, there's so many African-American actors. You can say, oh, he's successful because this film makes X amount of money. So the parameter is always, how much money does the film make? Mm-hmm. Not what the meaning of the film was and how it changed people's life. So I saw a Vietnamese film at a World Film Festival, and it was a film called The Garden of the Buffaloes. It's a small film about a boy's transition to manhood, poor people, struggling to survive in the French colonial Vietnam. It's one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. I saw a film by an African filmmaker, Abdurrahman Sissoko, from Mauritania, grew up in Mali, Waiting for Happiness. One of the most beautiful films that I've ever seen. Those are the kind of films how I want to experience my ideas of film. If I were to look at the films in terms of the colors I saw in Waiting for Happiness, or the story that I saw in this thing, then I want to be identified with those kind of films. How can I translate the values, the very values of humanity that they brought to their films. There's no technological wizardry in what these films are. They were able to capture some place in the human soul, and the film was transformative for those who saw the film, and I'd imagine, I mean, for those who did the film as well. So that's the kind of way in which I want to see myself in terms of film.
How do you convince then studios, who are always looking at the bottom line, that there's something more to this art than just box office?
Well, I mean, I don't know how much time do you spend doing that? How much time do you want to devote to that? I mean, of course, they can give lip service to wanting to do that. They can set up their own little sector, a little small film sector. Then you go through a process of what they call development hell, and you go through a producer's deal, and you go through all that. There's so many other ways in which you can find money to do films. And it can be done. I mean, we get seduced by all the kind of flair about who's going to win this on this award, who's going to be nominated to that award or whatever, instead of kind of like paying attention to what this thing is about. Really, what is it about? Yeah. You know, and the whole idea is that you can seduce an audience to look at anything. You can make them believe anything. I mean, as witnessed by how we were made to believe that there was weapons of mass destruction. The weapons of mass destruction somewhere, and so you go to war on it. And half the people who agreed to go to war, most of the people who agreed to go to war, figured that these guys in Iraq had something to do with the 9/11. So if you could do that, then you could present people with material in which they could respond to their lives and the lives of others differently. And that's what I believe. I believe in the human capacity to do that. And so if that governs in some way the kind of choices I make, the kind of stories I want to tell, then that's what it is.
When you talk about making influence, making changes, and I've heard you speak and you talk about how important it is to vote. But when you're voting, the choices that we have, at least in this country, really aren't that different at some point. How do we really make a difference on foreign policy, on racial issues? How do we get that to change if these are the choices we really have?
I think that we have to go beyond the choices that we have. And we have to begin to look at democracy in a different kind of way. We have to believe that we could make that change. Bill Fletcher, who's the president of TransAfrica, and I was president of TransAfrica, and I worked on an article that talked about establishing the idea of a neo-rainbow coalition. The idea in that neo-rainbow coalition of finding ways in which we can reinvigorate or take back the Democratic Party. How can you make the Democratic Party what its destiny should be, a party of the people? How can you make it really effective? How can you talk about the real issues and the real needs of people? And you have to do that as expressed in this in our discussion about by working inside and outside of the party. Yeah. Yeah. All change has occurred, first of all, by what people did on the outside. How people confronted the issues on the outside. If you talk about the civil rights movement, if you talk about the movement for workers to gain the ability to organize, all of that happened on the outside. It began on the outside. You talk about the women's movement. All movements begin on the outside. And what happens in that is that you force the change from the outside, and you work in concert with what is happening in those progressive voices from the inside. So I think on one point, yes, I mean, we didn't have, in this past election, in the Democratic Party, I mean, to vote for Kerry was a vote basically to say that we're tired of the foreign policy and tired of the existing administration's policy. But that did not say what our real mission was. Right. But what are the things that we achieved at that particular point in time? We achieved an incredible mobilization of people, a way of organizing people, a way of getting to people those things like ACT, America Coming Together, MoveOn.org, the Hip Hop Summit, all those kind of things played a role in bringing another kind of elected to the polling place and making democracy, making a real democracy. Then you begin to translate that, because when you begin talking about the real issues that we face, whether those issues are issues in terms of Social Security now, or health care, or development. Those issues are real issues. Those issues are real issues that are not left issues or center issues or whatever. They're real issues that are happening with people. And so when you begin to deal with those, focus on those issues, what about an economy that doesn't create jobs, a boom that doesn't create jobs? What about the massive redistribution of wealth to those who already have a great deal of wealth? Those are the real issues. Those are the real issues. We have to confront people and allow people to kind of face and find out, how do I fight in my own best interest? And how do I overcome my fear? With that. I mean, there's a great deal of fear that's running rampant around here.
And that's where my question goes there. There's so many things. When you go through the list, the litany of what needs to change and what we need to look at, I'm sure people feel overwhelmed by it. And they feel like there's nothing we can do. It's so big. Where do you start? How do you know?
You start and say, you're not going to change it. This is not a movie. You're not going to change it overnight.
Yeah.
This takes place with years and time and planning and getting your message out there and having a concrete message, having the idea that these are the issues important, and knowing those. If we sat down with people and talked about the issue of education in this country and the collapse of education and the kind of insidious attempt to dismantle or demonize the public education system. If you sat down and talked with people about that, and what do we do? How do we bring that about? That's easy to talk about. We need smaller class sizes. We need better training for teachers. We need all those things. Children learn when you put the resources behind them learning. Mm-hmm. If we were to talk about healthcare and broke down healthcare and talked about preventative healthcare and not get caught up in all the other things, interest groups that have an interest in keeping the system the way it is, then we talk about that in a different kind of way. So there are ways in which you begin to build, and that's what we're in the course of building. This is not something that you take a vacation on. This is not something that's going to happen, because you're not going to building for this moment right here. You're building for the moments 5, 10, 15 years after that.
Will you see an impact of your work in your lifetime? A serious impact of it?
I think the impact of what's happening with all the work that we do, it has some impact. People grow. People find ways in which they become creative, in which they organize and struggle and everything else. I see that happening. That happens all the time. I mean, this event here, imaginative in a sense, that brought people here together in support of Trans-Africa Forum, was an attempt to, in a sense, to broaden our base and to talk to people in a different kind of way. And you know what? I believe that we're not off base. The things that we talk about that affect us domestically, that affect people of color, of African descendancy, globally, are things that affect us domestically.
Explain a little bit what Trans-Africa does.
But Trans-Africa really is a forum which talks about and educates people about foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa and the diaspora, the Caribbean, and also Latin America. And it wants people to be active in the process. It wants to create a democratic foreign policy objective. So those are the kind of things that Trans-Africa deals with. It talks about how do we get people to see the relationship between their own lives here domestically and what happens to people around the world. As I mentioned in my talk, that people, when I travel in the world, people see what happens here. They're concerned about the choices we make, because they know that it's going to have a profound impact on their lives.
And see, I see it from that angle. How do you get people here to realize to worry about them? Because they worry about what we do as a nation and all the impact we have.
I'm not saying not worried about. When I say they think about the choice that we make and the impact.
Well, the concern of that.
The concern and the impact with it. They're trying to do their thing as autonomous nations. Right. That's what they're trying to do with their stuff.
How do we get people here in our country to care about the other nation? Well, right now we're in such an isolationist movement now, and it's like, worry about what's going on here, worry about our own people. How do you educate them that what we do here and to other countries impacts back
But that's the thing about it. I mean, it's like these guys are talking, as the Native Americans would say, with a forked tongue. They know that you have to, that there's no way that you can exist without being a part of a world that involves everybody, that has everybody's included. They know that, but they seduce us into believing that the more we consume, the more happy, the more content we are. That our own the panacea for not knowing, for being disempowered, is to consume more. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, in that way, I think that it is happening in so many ways. I think it doesn't happen when we see it in the major press in the national press, but it is happening in other places as well.
Yeah. Were you always interested in these issues, or is this something that came later in life to you?
I majored in economics because I thought I wanted to go to Tanzania and work. So I've always been interested in Africa from the time I was 19 years old, 20 years old.
Where did the acting bug then come in, and how come that was the direction you went?
Well, I mean, I tell people this all the time. It began as doing community theater and what we call activist theater at the time. If I had not discovered Ethel Fugard and the writing of Ethel Fugard, the great South African playwright, I probably wouldn't have been an actor. But the Fugard gave me a vehicle in which I could channel my creative energy at the same time saying what was important for me in the world and whose side I was on in the world. And I'm very clear that actors decide whose side they're on in the world, you know. And certainly when you talk about the actors who have been important to me and who stand up as role models for me, certainly Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, Paul Robeson, Harry Belafonte, and all the entertainers that have passed this way and expressed some idea of changing the world, of fighting and struggling with people. Those are the people who resonate with me.
True or false, you were involved with the Black Panther Party?
We worked with the Black Panther Party in 1967. The Black Panther Party, which began in Oakland, California, had a very close alliance with the Black Student Union, which I was a member of the Central Committee of the Black Student Union in 1968, 69, 1970. And we had a very close working relationship with the Black Panther Party. We worked in the Black Panther Party's education program. We worked in the Black Panther Party's Breakfast for Children program. We often helped work on the Black Panther Party's newspaper.
Yeah, so activism has always been something you thought was worth your time.
Well, I mean, it becomes, I mean, I'm a child of the Civil Rights Movement,
yeah.
You know, and the first images and people who became heroes for me were people involved in the Civil Rights Movement, whether they were involved in SNCC or whether they were Dr. King or Malcolm X. Those are the first people who resonated with me.
A lot of America, I would say, had thought things were fine by the time the LA riots came along again in the 90s. When something like that happens and refocuses everybody on that these problems still exist, was it a surprise to you the way it all played out, or was it something you were expecting?
It's a very interesting, the film Grand Canyon is pretty prophetic. It was made before the LA riots. You can imagine that it was that Lawrence Kasdan made a film that expressed some kind of unsettlement about the world he lived in. I mean, he lived in Beverly Hills, and yet there's a community no more than about 20 minutes from him that he was completely isolated from. One in which it lived in a polarized world in a polarized city. So I don't think that it was a surprise to a lot of people at all. I think on the one hand, people may have thought it would have come sooner. I mean, the fact that if you're interested enough, perhaps if there had been leadership within those communities, instead of that leadership often being jailed or criminalized, the spread of drugs had reached epidemic portions in these communities. Perhaps what happened in '92 would have happened earlier. Mm-hmm. At some point in time, you know. But it seems as if both in Miami at the same time, there was also just about the same time there was a revolt in Miami as well. It seems as if the proliferation of drugs, particularly crack cocaine, in our community, in some sense, stalled a kind of a level of intense politicalization and also protest to what was really happening. The fact that you have more elected black officials, the fact that you have a semblance of people who represent wealth, success in the black community does not in any sense say what is really happening in that community. The fact that still gentrification was happening, still people were homeless, jobs were being lost, all those things, and communities were in some sense marginalized. These communities were marginalized. It's bound to happen. We may have seduced ourselves by looking at the television that these things that were a thing of the past. And the fact that we celebrate a king birthday or celebrate this and celebrate that does not in any instance give a real indication of what is really happening.
Have we been fixing the problem since those things happened, or have we just moved away from it again?
Well, the question is, I mean, I don't need to answer that. I mean, I'm sure that if you go to those communities that I talk about, those dispossessed communities, they can say that themselves, that no, we had not been fixing the problem. We criminalized the problem. You know, the problem resides now in the court, in the judicial system. There are more African-American males in jail than in college. That's the reality. That African Americans disproportionately are unlikely to have adequate health care. That African Americans disproportionately have less than a living wage. Those are real issues, you know. I mean, in fact, they're frightening issues in the sense that you look at it and everybody talks about it. For some reason, that the political will and the political commitment to do that has not come to the table. And there are people who have been out there who are fighting. There are people, courageous people, who are out there fighting to change that. People like Maxine Waters in L.A., people like Barbara Lee, and other. I can name just a few. Some people in the Progressive Caucus, Democratic Caucus, as John Conyers. There are people who've been out there who've been sounding the alarm, who've been out there day one sounding it. But on the one hand, their voices are often silenced in some way, are not reported. You have a news media that doesn't report the issue, doesn't talk about the issues.
So then how do we, an audience watching this right now, what can we do to start making a difference? What would be your message to folks watching this?
There's ways we can make a difference in our community every day, and first of all, we demand the truth about what's happening. We demand the truth what's happening in our cities. We demand the truth what's happening in our neighborhoods. And we recognize that we overcome the fear of demanding the truth. That's one of the things. We don't do that. We don't demand the truth. You know, I mean, it's easy to play golf and to get into your golf game and to talk about the latest football scores or whatever. And find the accompanying people to talk about those, than to talk about the real issues. Rarely do you find people who is willing to sit down and engage each other and to talk to each other about what the real issues, and to be honest and truthful with each other. You know, to sit down here and say, what is the real issue? You know, let's overcome whatever the kind of issue. It's on a one-to-one basis. Whatever kind of difference, what your images are, what do you think is happening? Because all of us want to kind of want to look into the crystal ball and realize some sort of romantic sense of the world that we live in, or the country we live in, you know, or the neighborhood we will live in, you know. I mean, we can become I want people to talk as much about the conditions of the communities surrounding them as they dote over their children or their grandchildren. The way I dote over my grandson is the way I want people to talk about everything else that's happening in the world. That he's not singularly my grandson, but he lives in a world, he's going to have to live in a world, and we both live in a world that we have to be concerned about. I want to spend as much time and be just as observant in every little thing that child does to everything that happens around us in the rest of the world. Now that sounds very simple. I mean, it sounds. What this guy's talking about? But we spend a lot of time talking about our children all the time. Our children did this. Our children did that. What do we talk about? Spending the same kind of energy talking about what's happening with other children, and not in a patronizing way, not in some way in since we feel this kind of this sense of benevolence in some way, but really try to find out why kids are placed in schools in which it's incapable for them to learn. You know, incapable. The schools do not provide the right atmosphere to learn. Why what's subsequent to that, why their parents are not working, And if we begin to talk about those issues, we'll find that those issues resonate in a different kind of way in other places. And usually, the question is, and the question, I remember one time, somebody stopped me in the gym one time and made a remark on something I said about the war in Afghanistan and the war, and that I didn't support it. And I said, look here, if you look at this, think about this. This is an older white gentleman. I said, if you think about this, every single war since World War II, the end of World War II, it's been fought against people of color. Every single one. You check that out. Every single war. And he looked at me real strange. He didn't have anything to say. So I'm going to say something, but the fact is that I see people of color who are being bombed. I see people of color who are being napalmed. I see people of color who are being massacred. I see people of color who are the ones that are often being demonized. They're the bad guys. And I'm going to look at it and say, interesting.
And on that note, we are out of time.
We're out of time. Thank you.
Danny Glover, thank you very much.
Okay.
To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.